Okay, in this video I'm going to show you how to trim. The first part of the video is going to show trimming a bowl, and the second part is going to show how to trim a cup. If you haven't learned how to use the Giffen grip from the previous video, which is prep for wheel throwing, how to use the Giffen grip, you'll need to do that first. Okay, so now when I've got my pot in the middle of the wheel, the Giffen grip is tight on it, I'm ready to start trimming. So the first thing I do when I trim is I use my small trimming tool and I make a little small dent or a little carving for my finger to put in. I always want to leave one finger in the center and balance my other hand against that hand when I'm trimming. My goal when I'm trimming is to shave the clay off the bottom half of the project on the outside to clean it up. I don't want the piece to fly off of the pottery wheel, so I have one finger in the center, and then just like throwing, I want my arms anchored against my legs, and I want to make sure that the tool is at the right angle. If I don't put it at the right angle, the clay won't be coming off in ribbons. You should see the clay come off in ribbons as you see here. My goal is first to define the foot. So in defining the foot, I'm pushing down and making the curve of the bowl. I left about a ½ inch of clay on the bottom so that I'd have a nice tall foot for this bowl. Putting my finger in the center, I'm going to push in on that foot area to make it a little smaller. Trimming is going to take practice. It's going to be important that you make a lot of objects so you can practice trimming the same way that you need practice throwing. You can really have the choice of using the smaller trimming tool or the larger trimming tool. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to define the width of my foot ring by just using the small tool and then making the defined edge to the very outer perimeter, and then removing the clay from the inside with the tool. This is usually where people mess up. They push too hard, or they trim too much, and they trim a hole all the way through the bottom of their project. So you can flick it, and if you hear it being hollow or the noise change, that's one good way to tell. You can take it off the Giffen grip and kind of measure it with your fingers. But if it's too thick, it might crack, and if it's too thin, you'll go right through. So it does just take a little bit of practice to gauge the thickness. But what I'm doing is I'm holding my hand still. You'll notice that both hands are touching the trimming tool, and I'm holding my tool as still as possible and gently pushing down until I see a ribbon of clay coming off. You don't want the ribbons to be thick. You want the thinnest ribbons possible. So when you're trimming, knowing what shape you're going for is really knowing the inside of the pot. So the inside shape is going to determine the outside shape. So what I'm doing now is I'm trimming the foot ring and the center part of the foot to match the outer curve of the bowl. So it should look like your slab bowl that you made, where it's a dome with a little ring of clay on top. The dome should look like one continuous curve, like it did when you stretched it over the hump mold that you were using, and then the foot ring itself should look like a little coil that you attached. And if you can do that, then you're going to have a really well balanced bowl. The next step is going to be to lightly wet the outside where I trimmed. When you trim, it leaves a rough surface, so we wet that very lightly with the sponge, and then we angle the metal rib and press down. That's going to compress the clay, and it's going to make the surface nice and smooth. You can use any part of the metal rib that you want. Just be careful when you're cleaning the mud off of the metal rib that you clean away from the edge so you don't cut your finger. So you can see I'm smoothing out the outside. That's going to make the outside have a nice polished, smooth surface. If I want to, I can try to do the inside as well by doing the same kind of polishing maneuver on the inside using part of the rib. Last thing I'm going to do is just kind of round the foot out with my fingers. If your clay is soft enough, your fingers are good. If it's a little harder, you can use the back side of a trimming tool. And we just want to make sure that the foot has no sharp edges and that it's nice and round. Once you're done, you'll take your pot off of the Giffen grip by rotating it, and you'll have a nice smoothed out bowl. Now, if you can see the surface, it's smooth. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this bowl in half. Now that the bowl is cut in half, I'm going to show you the profile of the bowl so you understand that we want a nice continuous curve, just like the bowl you made off the slump mold, but it's going to have a foot ring on it that's about the same thickness as the bottom, and we don't want to see any extra thin spots or any extra thick spots. So this is kind of what you're looking for. You don't need to cut your bowl in half. This was just an example of what it should look like from a cutaway view. Alright, now if you're going to be trimming a cup, you're going to want to use the Giffen grip arms. If you don't know how to use these arms, it'll be important that you watch the video on how to change the direction of the trimming pads and put the arms on. We want to make sure that the arms are holding the pot from the middle of the form we're doing the same thing we do with our bowl, putting a little dot with our finger to hold our hand still. This is me trimming with my right hand or with my left hand. The same thing is true. You want to make sure that you hold your hand on the top, on that little dot, the entire time you trim. Not doing that, it can let your pot jump and fly off the wheel, which would obviously ruin the project. So when trimming the foot on my cup, I'm trimming off some of the excess weight that I have on the bottom by just pushing down. That's going to kind of show a little foot area. I can then trim the sides in and kind of make the bottom round. It's very similar to trimming your bowl. It's just a different shape, and you need to use the trimming arms. You use the larger trimming tool to kind of round out surfaces and kind of make general areas nice and smooth and continuous lines. The smaller tool is able to cut a little deeper, a little faster, but it does leave kind of grooves or spiral lines. All right, now that I've kind of cleaned up the outside of the bowl, the cup, I've made it look nice and round. I'm going to make the foot a little bit straighter, and then I'm going to take the clay out of the middle so that I have a nice foot ring just like on my bowl. Again, we want to make sure that the walls of the cup are relatively an even thickness. If it is really thick on the bottom, it'll make the bowl or the cup kind of heavy. If we trim too much, we can trim right through any area of it. So trimming is something that you're going to need a lot of practice on. So I'd recommend, once you can throw a cylinder, throwing 4 or 5 cylinders and just realizing you might break a few as you trim. Because this process is very satisfying, it's fun to do, but if you take it a little too far, you can put a hole in your project. Alright, so I'm just removing more clay from the center, making sure that the center is a nice even thickness, and that it looks like it is a continual dome from the bottom of the pot. Sometimes you can blow onto the pot to get those little scraps off. Sometimes if a scrap is sitting there, it can kind of bounce your tool and make it, cut into your foot ring. So I'm just blowing on the pot to get the clay out of that little corner right there. You can see I'm just doing some final touches. I'm also going to use my sponge and my metal rib to smooth out the surface that I trimmed. If you don't smooth the surface out, it looks very grainy and sandy, and it affects the way the glazes look. It's always good just to kind of smooth out any area that you did trim. Usually we don't trim the top half of our pots. We want to make sure that we throw those to the correct thickness and keep them nice and smooth. We're really usually just trimming the bottom half. That isn't to say you can't trim the top of a cup or the top of a bowl. It's just a lot more difficult to hold it in place. So if you do plan on trimming the top, realize that there is a higher chance of it flying off the wheel or of it breaking. Now that I have my cup trimmed, I'm going to cut it in half as well and show it to you. Alright, now you can see that this cup still has a nice thin continuous wall. It has a foot ring that's sitting on top of it. You can see that it doesn't get too thick or too thin in any one spot. Maybe a little too thin towards where the edge of the foot is, but that's how you trim a cup.